Welcome to Hamilton the podcast.
What are you so sad about, Vinton?
You remember that last episode we did that was real difficult to do?
Yeah, that episode was about Burn. It was a really sad episode.
Yeah,
I remember that.
Do you remember how I had Hamilton news?
Yeah.
I didn't have to start the episode. I didn't do that this time.
You didn't come up with any Band-Aids?
Then we gotta just jump in, I guess.
Well, I don't know what you're so sad about. I mean, we're talking about Hamilton's son, right?
Yeah, first off, we're just going to talk about some whistling, some hanging out. It's going to be a grand old time. I'm going to go ahead and not think about the future. Let's dive into this happy song.
Well, I mean, his son lived until he was 90 years old, he served a little while as an acting Secretary of State under Andrew Jackson.
I remember that. And
he helped comprise all of the information about Alexander Hamilton's life, and he was his biographer. I mean, this is his legacy of the son of Alexander Hamilton. That's what we're talking about, right?
I think you might be off somewhere, though.
Did I study the wrong son?
You studied the wrong son.
But James Alexander Hamilton had a happier ending. Why do we have to talk about Philip?
Because James isn't in the musical.
Bummer. That's really sad.
James be in the musical? Welcome to Hamilton, our fictional podcast, where we talk about how everything's okay and everything's just fine and nothing bad ever happens.
Right. This is the fan fiction episode where we go into our alternate version of the way it should have ended in history.
In these United States of Hamilton.
He did become president. He lived into his long old age with his children, all of them who lived and never entered a duel. And he had his friend Aaron Burr over for tea and crumpets frequently.
They hugged it out.
It was all okay, guys. Happily ever after.
Party segregations never happened. There was never any party factions in America.
Right. They teamed up to end slavery and abolish it immediately. Yeah, that's great. We didn't need a civil war.
There was a quick sequel and women were included in it.
Exactly.
First woman president just after Hamilton, and the first black president after that, and then the first black woman president after that.
Yeah, Angelica Schuyler, right?
Yeah.
I would have voted for her.
She's got my vote. Not historically black, but
no, but she was at least the first woman president in this alternate world that we're creating.
Right. So that's not the podcast you're listening to. You are listening to the very factual, well, at least we hope so, podcast about Hamilton the musical, where we're going to have to dive into Blow Us All Away, and we all know what's about to happen.
It's okay. I have tissues, and I have about a gallon of my comfort drink, Arnold Palmer, in front of me, so I think I'm going to be okay.
So this song does start off on a happy note. There's whistling, there's skipping, there's dancing. Everything seems fine, especially coming right off of Burn.
Yeah, it's kind of a stark turn all of a sudden where Burn ends on such a heavy note. I hope that you burn, Alexander Hamilton. And then there's whistling, skipping, hopping, jumping. It's like the kid that we saw last time when he was 9 years old celebrating his 9th birthday is now the latest graduate of King's College, which at this point in time would have been known as Columbia instead of King's because it's inconvenient to be named after the king once you have a Revolutionary War against said king. Right. But yeah, Philip Hamilton's walking down the stage, and he's been following in his father's footprints right down to reciting his father's own lyrics. Dag, I amaze and astonish.
That's right. He, like I mentioned, is also whistling, and this seems like a happy thing. Unfortunately, for some of you theater nerds out there, you might know that whistling in the theaters, bad luck. That is one of the things you are not supposed to do. And I did a little research on this, found out that it's because back around the time that this was going on and everything, a lot of the crew in theaters were sailing crew, and their codes to each other were whistles. And so if you walked around whistling, there's a good chance that one of them would mistake it for a cue to drop something or lift something, and somebody could get killed.
Oh, interesting. I actually did not know that little bit of trivia myself. I've been in West Side Story before, and so I know what the whole the call is for some of the gangs to assemble there with the...
Right.
I don't think that our microphones are going to pick up whistling very well. I probably shouldn't do that. Probably sounds very shrill. We may have to edit it out.
It's definitely one of those things that isn't dangerous anymore because we don't have sailing crews working our stages anymore, but it's still one of those things of, oh, this is bad luck. Don't do this in the theater.
A little taboo thing like mentioning the name Macbeth on the stage. You talk about whistling in the theater, my first thoughts initially go to The King and I, Whistle a Happy Tune. And
right.
I think of how positive it is to be whistling in the middle of a dark time, a happy time. You're holding on to some optimism, some type of optimism. I imagine this Andy Griffith moment where everyone's walking down the stage and everything is fine. and that is what it looks like for just a moment.
So like you mentioned, he comes out saying, "Meet the latest graduate of King's College. I probably shouldn't brag, but dag, I amaze and astonish. Like father, like son."
This is a reference to the fact that as a 19-year-old here, Philip Hamilton would have just in the last year graduated King's College when he was getting ready to confront George Eaker in his duel. He had just recently been a graduate right at the time when the challenge is issued and everything is happening.
Yeah. Eaker was quite a bit older. I think he was 27 at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So you see a lot of Philip's adolescence and his naivete and his brashness that his father had at his age.
Right. I've been involved in youth ministry for over a decade now. And so I look at some of the kids that I brought up and raised up and taught back when they were in junior high and when they were 18 and 19 years old. And I think about the fact that when I was 27 years old and I was looking back on some of the 19-year-olds I raised or didn't raise necessarily, but some of them that I mentored at least, they were never people that I would have ever challenged to a duel. I cannot even comprehend, even the most bratty of the kids that ever went through the doors, I would never have challenged them to a duel. If they're a decade younger than me, it's just strange to think of challenging a teenager like that.
Right. And you see, Eaker is going to basically speak down to Philip in that condescending way of, "You're a child. Get out of my face."
Right. But George Eaker, while he looks down on Philip Hamilton and his legacy in general, the scholars disagree. The scholars say that Philip has the same virtuosity and brains as his pops.
And yeah, and that could refer to Philip's teachers at King's College. It could refer to historians later. Just like Hamilton said, "Don't be shocked when your history books mention me." It's that line of, hey, in the future, historians will look back and see I was a smart guy.
Yeah, and historians do look back on Philip Schuyler now and say that he was following in the path that his father had set. When you read Ron Chernow's biography, he talks about how Philip Hamilton had followed a career path that almost exactly replicated his father. He graduated a year before this duel happened at Columbia College. He graduated with high honors as a fine orator. He had studied to be a lawyer, and he was looking forward to a prosperous and really optimistic future as a lawyer in New York.
Right. Chernow mentions that one of Eliza's friends asked whimsically at one point if she could notify the renowned Philip that she had heard he had outstripped all his competitors in the race of knowledge and daily gained new victories by surpassing himself.
Right, and later Alexander Hamilton will look back on his son and reference Philip as his family's eldest and brightest hope, the one that they've lost now by the time he writes this, but he's talking about how optimistic the future was for this Philip guy.
Right. Now, the ladies would say that his brain's not where the resemblance to his father stops, which is a nice reference there to Hamilton's reputation as a player. Maybe he could have had a feral tomcat named after him as well.
That's true. I like that similarity is made and that connection is made there. But let's just admit, it's a little odd if a woman comes up to you and says, "Hey, you look like your father. You want to get it on or something?" Hey, that's not a real big pickup line for most people.
Hamilton was known for his good looks, so I guess it was kind of a compliment.
Right, I guess so. But I would feel really weirded out if a lady came up to me and said, "Hey, you look like your dad, and you want to date me?"
Yep. Yep, I see what you're saying now. He says, "I'm only 19, but my mind is older." Another My Shot echo.
Mm-hmm.
"Gotta be my own man, like my father, but bolder." That's a high bar to pass there. You're talking about the guy that just wrote the Reynolds pamphlet.
And the Federalist Papers and created a lot of the architecture of the American government and had fought in a war. So yeah, he has a huge legacy to surpass.
Yeah, and not to take it there immediately here, but it's a little bit of foreshadowing. It's boldness that brings both of them their deaths.
That's true. Here he's talking about following in his father's footsteps, but in a strange, ironic twist, the father will actually follow in the son's footprints in a few years.
Right. In a lot more ways than one, as we'll see. There's a lot of coincidences involved in those two duels.
Very true.
Then he says, "I shoulder his legacy with pride." In this rhyme here, this boulder and shoulder echoes Alexander's lines in My Shot. "These New York City streets get colder. I shoulder every burden, every disadvantage." Philip, unlike his father, actually has some of those advantages, though, like a home and a family.
Yeah, that's true. That's a definite advantage that Philip had because Alexander had worked so hard to make sure that his wife and kids never were going to be as helpless as his mother and he were when they grew up.
Right. And You see Philip picked up on that legacy theme here in our musical.
Oh, yeah. He is listening to his father's own rhetoric, and he is picking it up. He is continuing it. He says that I shoulder his legacy with pride. I am a Hamilton with pride. I'm going to actively protect that legacy, and that's why he does start the same career path and follow in the same footsteps that his father has.
Right.
Lots of people, when they look back on Philip Hamilton, talk about how he had a promising future. They had an optimistic ideal of where he was going, and he was really intelligent, really smart, really good looking, but he also had a bit of a wayward streak. He had a little bit of a time when he, just like we were talking about how he had that tomcat phase with like his father, right. He had a period of time during his days at Columbiana College when he was called by Robert Troup, one of his dad's friends, a sad rake. This guy who was very concerned about his appearance with the ladies and his interesting escapades in that time. And true to his form, Alexander Hamilton gave a strict but loving response to send rules to the college for Philip Hamilton. He sent rules for his son to follow. And he sent this letter that said, rules for Mr. Philip Hamilton from the 1st of April to the 1st of October. He is to rise no later than 6 o'clock, the rest of the year no later than 7. If earlier, he deserves commendation. So let's compliment him if he wakes up early. And 10 will be the hour of going to bed throughout the year. And then he goes on and he outlines in this whole schedule, he says, at this point in time, you will make sure you're studying law. At this point in time, you get a little bit of flexibility to eat a meal. He's kind about that. He gives him about 2 hours in the evening to say you can do whatever you'd like during that 2-hour slot. And then you have 3 hours to do whatever reading you want. And you can read for fun, but you have to be reading. And then he goes on and outlines his weekend activities and really doesn't give him a lot of leeway. He says, here's the strict schedule you have to follow, my son, because you can't set your own schedule yourself because you're a teenager. And in one letter that Eliza received from Alexander Hamilton, he closed it with the words, I am anxious to hear from Philip, that naughty young man. It's just an odd thing for your dad to say.
Yeah, that little scamp. The reason he would set those rules is because he had high hopes for Philip.
Yes.
He used to say, as we saw in Dear Theodosia, and as Philip himself brings up here, I used to hear him say that someday I would blow us all away. And we mentioned it then, we'll mention it here again real quick. 2 connotations there. Could mean he'll amaze. Also reference, he's going to get shot, to get blown away.
That's true. I really love that reference back to Dear Theodosia. It's a sweet moment when you have 2 fathers singing to their newborn children, and just singing about the hope they have for their future. And this is a bit of a reminder about that Alexander had a huge hope for his son. He believed that one day his son would blow everybody away. He had that hope when Philip was born, and he had that hope when Philip was sent to college. He sent a couple letters back and forth with him when he was at Columbiana, and he would always close it out with, a good night to my darling son, adieu, A. Hamilton. And so he's very loving, very sweet, very strict about what he needs to be doing and what he needs to be studying because he wants his son to rise up and follow that legacy, but he's so loving about it.
So in our performance here, Philip walks up to a couple of ladies on the stage and says, ladies, I'm looking for Mr. George Eaker. Made a speech last week, our 4th of July speaker. He disparaged my father's legacy in front of a crowd. I can't have that. I'm making my father proud. And this George Eaker that he's looking for was a young Republican lawyer who was a strong supporter of Thomas Jefferson and in history gave this speech on the 4th of July celebration in 1801. And in the speech, he praised Jefferson for saving the country from the likes of Hamilton.
That's right. President Jefferson had a personal stake in whipping up a patriotic fever on this holiday because he was the writer of the Declaration of Independence. That's what Chernow puts into his biography about this. He says that Jefferson supporters would always have this day to repeatedly emphasize, hey, Jefferson is the guy that gave us the Declaration. Jefferson did this. I mean, it went through the committees and the people rewrote stuff, but Jefferson is the guy that had his name attached to it. And so Captain George Eaker steps forward and he's giving this whole speech as a famous lawyer in New York, and he does put all of the blame on Hamilton and all of the praise on Jefferson, saying that Jefferson came in and thwarted the attempts of a Federalist aristocracy being in the White House. And he says that President Jefferson is the one that saved America from that aristocracy. And Hamilton, by the way, is the reason that we probably had any type of conflict with France to begin with. He doesn't put any of the blame on the XYZ affair or on the French privateering or anything big. He just talks about how Hamilton raising his army is the reason we have any foreign problems at all.
Yeah, he openly accused Hamilton of misusing his position and blamed him at least partially for the Quasi-War. And his speech was published in newspapers, which is how Philip probably found out what he had said.
It's interesting you should mention that Philip probably read about this in the newspaper because, while that's absolutely true, another little newspaper-related coincidence is that this is the point in history when Alexander had just created the New York Evening Post and helped to establish that. And their first major story, 1 week after their maiden issue, was Philip Hamilton killed in a duel.
Oh, man.
Hamilton creates this newspaper, and 1 week into it, his son is the big headline. That's
horrible.
That's tragic. Yeah.
So Eaker was basically talking trash on Philip's dad, and he can't have that because he's making his father proud. This line also calls back to My Shot, where Elder Hamilton said, "I promise that I'll make y'all proud." There's a lot of references to My Shot here because with My Shot, Hamilton was declaring who he was and what he was going to do. And here Philip is trying to show the world what kind of person he is and what he's going to do.
But whereas in My Shot, the response of Hamilton's friends was, let's get this guy in front of a crowd. Here, when Philip Hamilton speaks and he says, I'm making my father proud, he is actually going to seek out that crowd himself to put himself in front of it and make a scene, because he goes to these people and says, hey, have you found this guy? I'm looking for him. I'm looking for George Eaker. I'm trying to find him. And he's going to be the one actively pursuing that crowd himself.
Yeah, and like I mentioned, he approaches these two women, and the recordings, you don't really know who they are. They're just part of the cast, respond to them.
Right.
Actually, and it's going to bring up a funny point here in a second when we get to it in the lyrics, these two women are named Martha and Dolly in the lyrics, which, if you know a little bit about your history, you might know that that's the name of Jefferson and Madison's wives.
Yeah, I love that little reference. I don't think it's something that we're necessarily supposed to read into for the sake of the musical integrity, because they never name them. But the fact that it's named that in the written lyrics is really a funny little jab there. I love that.
Martha here says, I saw him just up Broadway a couple of blocks. Kind of funny. The show's on Broadway. They're talking about going to Broadway.
Yeah.
He was going to see a play. Philip says, I'm going to go visit him. And Dolly says, God, you're a fox.
That Dolly Madison is smitten.
Then Philip says, y'all look pretty good in your frocks. How about when I get back, we all strip down to our socks? And they say, okay.
And you know when I'm down to just my socks, it's time for business. That's why they call them business socks.
That's why I call it business time.
It's business. It's business time.
So maybe Lin-Manuel's taking a little subtle revenge on Hamilton's behalf, naming these two characters here in the lyrics and having them say those certain things. I don't know. Maybe.
It's a little bit of a subtle way for him to defend his father's legacy there by getting back at Madison and Jefferson.
Also, the person who is playing Dolly here was also the person who played Sally in What Did I Miss? So a little bit of dual casting there to make things a little interesting.
What I missed was all of that before I read the lyrics. I missed all of that.
By the way, another note that I ran across almost has nothing to do with this, but I thought it was interesting how so many things in history in this time with these few people in our musical are tied together. While researching this, I came across a note that said that Aaron Burr actually introduced James Madison to Dolly Todd Payne. So he's the reason they got together.
Oh, wow.
Our history is so interlaced with these people in this musical.
Matchmaker, make me a match. Aaron Burr as the person bringing people together.
That's right. So like Philip says here, he's going to go visit them in his box on Broadway. And historically, that's what happened. He went and visited them at the Park Theater, and he took his friend Richard Price, and together they met him in the lobby and challenged him to duels.
That's right. I'm relying a lot on Ron Chernow's description here because he has what I found to be the best description of this entire event. This entire Philip Hamilton, George Eaker duel is really well described by Ron Chernow, obviously. And Chernow thinks that it might have just been by chance that Philip happened to be at the same show as George Eaker, but they're at this show, and then Price and Hamilton start throwing insults and taunting George Eaker while he's trying to watch the show. They go into his box, and they have some taunts back and forth, and they're kind of heckling him, and then Eaker says, hey, let's step outside, and go into the lobby. They have some words back and forth, and Eaker, I guess, issued a comment under his breath about those darned rascals. And that, at the time, was a really loaded word.
Right.
And it was usually a word used with the connotation of them being about to go to blows. They're about to issue a duel and have these things. And so they're here. Philip Hamilton and Richard Price are kind of the antagonists in this scene where they're going forward. They're bugging Eaker, and Eaker calls them rascals. And both Price and Hamilton will end up having a duel with Eaker separately.
Right. And in the staging at this moment, Philip approaches George Eaker in his box, which is on that second story of our stage where you have around the outer rim there. And they've actually have a little box that he's sitting in watching a performance that's going on the stage. It's a little bit meta there. And they start having that dialogue.
Yeah, it reminds me of A Midsummer Night's Dream, where you have a play within a play, where you have people sitting on a stage as an audience member watching a show on the stage. Yeah, this set of duels, the two duels, the Price duel and the Philip Hamilton duel with George Eaker, happened really, really quickly. You remember the 10 duel commandments, where you see that you're supposed to have a lot of time where your seconds try to go back and forth and negotiate a peace. The challenge was issued. This whole confrontation happened on a Friday night while they're at the theater in Manhattan, and they start heckling Eaker in his box, and then Eaker's finally saying, okay, fine, I'm not going to ignore you anymore because the audience is watching. Let's go into the lobby. Let's talk for a while. He calls them darned rascals. They come to blows almost. They go to a tavern and talk for a little while longer. Eaker goes back to his show and says, I expect to hear from you again. And both Price and Hamilton say, you shall. Eaker goes and finishes his show, and by the time the show is ended, Richard Price has already delivered him a letter challenging him to a duel. Already, because he was called a rascal. And it's interesting at that point. So that's a Friday night. Saturday, Philip Hamilton, to his credit, goes and talks to his uncle, John Church, and he talks to another friend of his, David Jones, a young lawyer who had worked under Governor Jay at the time. And so he talks to them, and they advise him to seek a peaceful resolution. So Philip Hamilton didn't issue a quick challenge to a duel like his friend did. But things still went very quickly again. Right. Because remember, the theater confrontation's Friday night. Sunday morning, you see that Richard Price and George Eaker have their fight, their duel, and they both issue some shots back and forth. No one gets shot. Everyone ends with all their limbs intact. No one was hurt. No one was injured. That ends peacefully. They both acknowledge that the other one has honor and showed up respectfully. And then that afternoon, Sunday afternoon, John Church and David Jones tried to negotiate with George Eaker's second to try to get a peaceful resolution to the Philip Hamilton challenge. But because Eaker held Philip more accountable for the theater incident than Price, he refused to let Philip Hamilton off the hook.
Right.
Even if Philip apologized for his rudeness, he refused to say, I will accept that. So the next day, they showed up on the dueling ground in Weehawken, New Jersey, with their guns, and things went down.
Yeah. And their lyrics happens slightly different. You have Philip approaching George, and George is saying, shh, I'm trying to watch this show. Philip says, well, you should have watched your mouth. A little bit of wordplay there.
I like that.
And instead of saying rascal, Lin-Manuel chose to use the word scoundrel here. He calls him a scoundrel, him and his father.
Right, because when I think of the word rascal, I think of alfalfa and Darla and the little rascals.
Yeah, it's almost like a cute word.
Right.
In these days. Whereas scoundrel, the way we think of scoundrel is more accurately what they thought of as rascal back then.
Right.
Similar connotations, at least. George says, I didn't say anything that wasn't true, which is pretty similar to the way that Alexander later tells Burr, I can't apologize because it's true. Later on in our musical, escalating tensions that led up to that fatal duel.
Right.
And George then speaks down to him, like I mentioned earlier, saying, I'm not your little schoolboy friends. But before he can even finish saying that, Philip jumps right in. See you on the dueling ground, which, as Robbie said, is going to be Weehawken's, the same place that Aaron Burr and Elder Hamilton, they're going to have their duel.
I like the ambitious eagerness that Philip has in this moment where he says, that is, unless you want to step outside and go now.
Right. George just replies, I know where to find you. Get out of here. I'm watching this show.
Don't you just hate it when people interrupt you when they talk during the movie?
I mean, when they're trying to duel me, probably, yeah. So as you see, he's again talking down to him. He's dismissive of him. He's like, get out of here. He's obviously seeing this 8-year age difference and this lack of respect. On the off-Broadway version of this song, there's a few lines in between here and when Philip's going to have this talk with his father, where Aaron Burr actually approaches Alexander Hamilton first. And he says, your son's engaging in a duel in Weehawken. Hamilton says, where did you hear that? And Burr says, they've got the whole street talking. Thank Theodosia for warning me. Now I'm warning you. You've got the facts, Alexander. What are you going to do?
That raises a really good question, because obviously with all this happening historically, you have to ask the question, where was Alexander Hamilton in all this?
Right.
He is one of the patron. He had just started as the patron of the New York Evening Post. They're getting ready to cover all these things. He knows what's going on. He is actively involved, but he is also in a bit of a pickle, because he's trapped in the dilemma that would eventually plague him later with the Aaron Burr dilemma, where he believes that you have to address any threat to your integrity, any insult to your personal character, by following the gentlemanly code of honor, the code duello. But he also was at that point of starting to grow increasingly critical of duels. As he led the army under President Adams and General Washington, he had issued a circular that was trying to curb the practice of dueling. He tried to make people not duel as often, and he was growing in this religious ideal that dueling was probably wrong anyways. So he did have this principle that said that maybe if you do the French practice of a thing called deloping, I don't know if that's pronounced correctly, but it's the delope, where you throw away your shot in the middle of a duel. While it's technically against the Irish code of code duello, it is also something that was very common to throw away your shot in the middle of a duel if you didn't believe that dueling was right. So he's conflicted. He has conflicting opinions about what he should do in this situation, what Philip should do, but he's also conflicted about how involved he should be, given the fact that he is Alexander freaking Hamilton, and the person that his son is fighting is a young Jeffersonian. His involvement would bring in a lot of Federalist drama, and that's why historically he worked through John Baker Church, his brother-in-law, instead of himself, to give some of the counsel and the legal advice, and to actually be one of the seconds counseling Philip Hamilton there. So Alexander knew about what was going on, but he couldn't be very publicly spoken at the time.
Right, and you see, like Robbie said, that Hamilton's grown here. He's not the same person he was in the 10 Duel Commandments when he was so eager to start that duel over words that were said. But he's also still not listening to Washington, who says it's not worth it.
Yeah, I like that comparison there, because Washington in the original duel that we saw in the first act, you saw that he says, my name's been through a lot, I can take it. Right. Here, Hamilton's name is the one that's getting raked through the mud, and Hamilton doesn't have the exact same Washington approach, but he doesn't have the Hamilton approach either. He's just taken a step or two in the direction of Washington, but he's kind of in the middle of those two responses.
Right. And Philip knows this, as you see here in the lyrics. He says, I doubt you would have let it slide if you had heard what he had said about you, and I was not about to. And Hamilton's like, slow down. Wait, did Hamilton just say slow down?
Hamilton just said talk less, or talk more slowly. Slow down, wait for it. That's definitely him incorporating some of those Burrine instincts. Burrite?
Right.
Burrish?
Yeah. Okay.
Those things that were like Burr. The attitude that was like Burr. Wait for it. Just calm down. Let's take this one step at a time. See what we can do to address the problem. It's kind of like he's becoming more of a father figure.
Right. And I like that Philip here is so eager to challenge someone to a duel, and then he doesn't even know how a duel is done. He has to ask him. They don't exactly cover this in boarding school. Then Hamilton says, did your friends attempt to negotiate peace? And Philip tells him, well, he refused to apologize. We had to let the peace talk cease. So Hamilton accepts it here. He says, where is this happening? Philip tells him, across the river in Jersey. They have that moment where they both say,
everything is legal in New Jersey.
Right. Which it wasn't legal in New Jersey.
Not technically.
But Jersey was known as the place where people got away with a lot of things. People turned blind eyes to a lot of things.
And it's another opportunity for New Yorkers to jab at their New Jersey friends across the river.
Right, which is why on Broadway I think this gets such a laugh.
Right.
It reminds me of a line in the supergroup with Bob Dylan and George Harrison and Tom Petty in the song Tweeter and the Monkey Man. Bob Dylan says, in Jersey, anything's legal as long as you don't get caught.
And that's kind of the point here, that they go across the river and they found a little cove that was on a sandbank that was apparently only accessible during low tide, when the river had kind of gone out a little ways. And so at a certain time of day, you actually could not reach them without going across a river. And so they're kind of off on the side, not exactly where people can point their prying eyes. And you see that opportunity where they're hidden a little bit on the bank of the river there on the New Jersey side in Weehawken.
Right.
And I like how Hamilton goes into his problem solving very quickly. He asked a couple pointed questions to figure out what had been taking place so far, and now he officially says, all right, this is what you're going to do. And he gives him some instructions that are going to set the tone for the way his duel with Aaron Burr will happen eventually as well. He wants his son to stand there like a man and to stand there with honor and with pride in front of George Eaker. And he says, stand there like a man until Eaker is in front of you. When the time comes, fire your weapon in the air. This will put an end to the whole affair. Just throw away your shot. This is another hint that it is not the same Hamilton we saw at the beginning of Act 1, because the Hamilton in Act 1 said, I will not throw away my shot. I will not throw away my shot. I'm not going to wait for it. Here he's saying, hey, son, slow down, wait for it, go ahead and throw away your shot. This is Hamilton growing up somewhat.
And in history, Hamilton actually told Philip to not shoot until after Eaker had shot and then discharge his weapon into the air. And in history, it kind of happened that way, at least for a moment, because after they counted to 10, they just stared at each other for a minute or two, and then Eaker shot.
That's got to be intense.
Yeah.
It's something that I had read about how both sides, after Philip Hamilton was shot in the side, he is acknowledged by both sides of the dueling parties as having stood there with honor, not taking a shot and not running away from the danger. And so Eaker did affirm, once Philip Hamilton was on the ground, that he took it like a man, so to speak, to use all of these outdated, bad gender stereotypes. And a lot of people debated, just like they will eventually debate whether Alexander Hamilton did this, but they debate whether Philip even meant to discharge his gun in the first place, whether it was just an accidental, involuntary trigger pull that had happened to let his gun go off once he was shot in the side. It's a lot of the criticism and the speculation about what happened between Philip Hamilton and George Eaker is going to be echoed by Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr's duel, where people will often say, did Alexander mean to fire his gun, or was it an accidental shot, or was he actually trying to shoot, but he got thrown off because he was shot first? And it's something that we may never know all of the details because we weren't in the room where it happened, or on the side of the river where it happened.
And Hamilton's going to say, to take someone's life, that's something you can't shake. Again, showing that growth he's had, which is something you see in real life with veterans who have been through war. They might go into war being excited to go to war, fight for their country, but they come out of it realizing what it is to take life.
Absolutely. That's a completely believable growth in his own personal philosophy. He's seen death now more than he did when he was in the Caribbean islands in the West Indies, more than when he had just been a teenager. He's been through the war now. He's been through some really tough things, and he doesn't want to just throw those away anymore. At the beginning of the musical, we saw Aaron Burr singing about how Hamilton had nothing to lose, so he was just pursuing every single thing he could. Now, Hamilton has stuff to lose. He has a wife, he has kids, he has prominence, and he is going to lose them.
Yeah. It's also worth noting that Hamilton here says, if this Mr. Eaker is a man of honor, he'll follow suit and not shoot. The musical is basically crying out over and over again that Mr. Eaker's not a man of honor from the very beginning.
Yeah, he continually...
Over and over.
Yeah, he's condescending, he's patronizing, very rude.
Yeah, and we're going to see here in a moment that he skips the niceties when the duel's about to start, and then he doesn't even wait for the count. It's almost as if this musical is just crying out to Philip over and over again. He's not a man of honor. He's not a man of honor. Listen to your father when he says if he's a man of honor, because he's not, and you shouldn't do this.
Yeah, and here Philip does have that trepidation, that caution. He says, what if he decides to shoot? Then I'm a goner. He doesn't just take the words of advice from his father and not question them, because he is his own man, like his father, but bolder. He's questioning that, and he's a little bit nervous, but Alexander does give that advice, saying he will follow suit if he's a man of honor. You can trust this, that I am confident that you're not going to be killed here, because one, you're going to stand up for your honor. You're going to do what's right. You're not going to take a life, because that's something you can't shake. It changes a man once you've actually taken a life, whether it's in war times or otherwise. And then I love that Alexander turns his attention to Eliza here. And he says, Philip, your mother can't take another heartbreak.
Right. It's interesting, isn't it? That's what he would say. Yeah, go ahead and fight that duel. Just don't shoot, because your mom can't take heartbreak of you killing someone. Alexander, your son could die. That's worse heartbreak.
Yeah. And I think that Alexander here, and this is complete speculation, I think you can open it to lots of different interpretations. I do want to believe that Alexander truly doesn't think that George Eaker is going to shoot his son.
Right.
He believes that honorable men will behave honorably. He's seen the successful side of dueling. I think that he probably believes that that's what's going to happen here.
Right.
But he's wrong.
And, of course, we know what he means by another heartbreak here in the musical. He means the Reynolds pamphlet, the stuff that just went down. In history, though, it might be referring to even more because just before this, Peggy Schuyler died.
Yeah, historically, a lot of things are piling up on Eliza's emotional plate, so to speak. She's just lost her mother, she's pregnant with her 8th child, and it is a big, complicated, stressful time in her life. And to put that in the context of the Reynolds pamphlet having just been published, and Hamilton himself having just wounded her in this way, you see that Hamilton hasn't actually spoken with Eliza yet, but he's still thinking about her. He's probably thinking about her a lot while he's sleeping in his office instead of in their bed.
Right.
But here he's thinking about her and says, your mother can't take another heartbreak. I don't want you to die. I don't want you to take a life. But he still puts his son in a risky situation.
Right. And just to mention it, since we won't get a good time to later, I really like the letter that Hamilton writes Eliza to let her know about her sister's passing, because Hamilton was actually with Peggy when she passed. He wrote this letter saying, "On Saturday, my dear Eliza, your sister took leave of her sufferings and friends. I trust to find repose and happiness in a better country. Viewing all that she had endured for so long a time, I could not but feel relief in the termination of the scene. She was sensible to the last and resigned to the important change. Your father and mother are now calm. All is well as it can be, except the dreadful ceremonies which custom seems to have imposed as indispensable in this place, and which at every instant open anew the closing wounds of bleeding hearts. Tomorrow the funeral takes place, the day after I hope to set sail for New York. I long to come home to console and comfort you, my darling Betsy. Adieu, my sweet angel. Remember the duty of Christian resignation. Ever yours, A.H." I love the way he describes death there. Hopefully to find repose and happiness in a better country. He's such a good writer, guys. And going back to the lyrics, after all of this instruction, Philip changes the way he addresses his father. He's no longer saying Pops. He says Father, as this conversation becomes more serious.
Yeah, I think that shows how he comes in with the adrenaline rushing. He's speaking a little bit too quickly. He's like, Pops, if you had only heard. And then now he is calmer. It's like that parenting technique worked out where he said, calm down. Let's talk through the details. Let's figure out what's happening here. He says, okay, Father. It's a little bit more rational here.
Almost like he's thrown back just a little bit by his father not being super eager for this duel and be like, yeah, take him down. Let's do this.
Yeah, it's true. But Alexander Hamilton's priority here is that his son does not get the young man's blood on his conscience.
Right,
he says, promise me. You have to promise.
Exactly. So Philip promises, and Hamilton says, come back home when you're done, which is sort of a callback to that would be enough. When Eliza says a very similar thing to Alexander, so long as you come home at the end of the day, that would be enough. Then Hamilton says, take my guns, even though in history it would be Uncle John Baker Church's pistols that Philip would take. He says, be smart, make me proud, son. And then Philip goes into this verse here, referencing his introduction in the stage musical, where he says, I'm a poet. And he goes through his poem. Here, these words are kind of referencing that, but telling a new story. I'm a little nervous, but I can't show it. I'm sorry, I'm a Hamilton with pride. You talk about my father, I can't let it slide.
Yeah, I like that in that particular lead up to this, he is wrestling with his own identity. He's showing us who he believes he is. He says, I'm a poet. That's who I want to be known as. That's what I'm supposed to be. That's who I am deep down. I'm a lover, not a fighter. But here he says, I'm a Hamilton with pride. I have my legacy that I'm trying to protect, the Hamiltonian legacy that is on my shoulders now. I don't take that lightly. I take it seriously. And so he says, my identity is that I'm going to stand up for my father here.
And musically, it's a little subtle, but when he talks about being nervous and not being able to show it, the music quivers a little bit to give you that idea of nervousness. And he says, how was the rest of your show? But George immediately, I'd rather skip the pleasantries. Not a man of honor, Philip.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting here how Philip's attitude has calmed down since the first theater confrontation.
Yeah.
He was the one that was the bully, the aggressor, the one that barged in and started talking smack on George Eaker. And then here he says, "How was the rest of your show, George? Why don't we just be pleasant about it?" And right. George has not forgotten. George is very angry still. He is very condescending, very upset. And you're right. He doesn't respond honorably. He says, "I'd rather just skip to the part where I can kill you."
Yeah, grab your pistol. Let's go. Philip says, "Confer with your men, then the duel will commence." And there's this emphasis here. After we count to 10. It's emphasized in the recording, at least.
And the ensemble repeats it. Count to 10.
Count to 10.
And it's almost as if Philip here is reciting the words that he memorized from his father, saying, "This is how it's going to go. The duel commence after you count to 10. And he repeats to himself then, "Look him in the eye. Aim no higher. Summon all the courage you require. Then slowly and clearly aim your gun toward the sky." It's almost like he's reminding us what he's supposed to do. Like he's repeating it in his own mind like a mantra, trying to calm himself down because he is nervous. He aims his gun towards the sky, and the ensemble starts counting.
Right. And it's interesting to me, while counting is a big theme in this musical, counting to 10 specifically, even with the duels, when Philip counts with his mom, he only counts to 9. It's almost as if he was never destined to reach 10.
Yeah, Philip has a lot of opportunities where he's counting and his counting gets cut short. And It's always disappointing.
Yeah.
We'll see one of those in the next song.
So at 7, that shot's fired. And that brings us to the end of our song. And the last we'll see of Eaker on the stage.
Yeah, George Eaker fires his gun at 7. He did not wait till the count of 10.
No.
If you want to emphasize your argument there that he's not a man of honor, there it is. He didn't follow the rules.
So, starting into our next song, Stay Alive, the Reprise, when Philip is shot, he starts to move into slow motion on the staging. People come up behind him and pick him up, and they move him to a table or a slab and lay him down. And an interesting note about the music, there's this beat that's a heartbeat.
Right, on the dun-dun.
Yeah.
Dun-dun. Dun-dun. On the 1s and 3s of it, you go straight through it all, and it... As a percussionist, I've done this effect. I did percussion underscoring for Electra as a Greek play that was played one time, and there were moments when I had to play a heartbeat on a timpani and stop at a certain moment. And that heartbeat is played throughout this entire song until the very gut-wrenching end.
Right. It's also interesting in the music here that Philip the whole time sings in C major, while his mother and father who come out onto the stage are singing in C minor, showing that he's the hopeful one when they're in despair even.
He's trying to be optimistic about it all when he greets them both.
The ensemble is singing Stay Alive. It's an interesting point I saw commented on the internet. It might be a little bit of a stretch that it's only the women in the show that ever say stay alive. And the point that was brought up in the comment was that at that day and age, when we were left at home while men were out to work and they were out doing the dangerous things, going to war and all these things. And so they were the one at home saying, stay alive. I need you to stay alive. You're the breadwinner. I need you.
Yeah, and that point is definitely what was made in the original articulation of Stay Alive, before the reprise here, when you see that they're singing over the men that they've sent off to war, the sons and the brothers that they've sent off to war. And here you see a lot of parallels and a lot of contradictions to the first time that Stay Alive was sung in this musical. One of the biggest things that I take away from this reprise of Stay Alive is how the first time that Stay Alive is sung in this musical, Alexander's confidence is impeccable, where he says, "We cut supply lines, we steal contraband, we pick and choose our battles and places to take a stand, and every day, sir, entrust me with command, and every day, no, he dismisses me out of hand." It's like he is in the middle of this conflict, but he knows what to do. He's in the middle of a stressful time, but he has the answers. Exactly. And he thinks that he has the right to lead. He should be in charge of things. He should be taking action. And he is ambitious and he's climbing up. There's a little bit of cockiness in that. But overall, he is confident in the middle of the stress. And here, in the reprise, Alexander Hamilton is anything but confident. Not only does he not have the answers, he has questions to which he does not have an answer. He has questions and he is terrified of what is happening, and he comes in and he asks the doctor, "Where is my son?" And he hardly even gets the answer to that question before he asks his next question when he says, "Is he alive?"
Right. And historically, this doctor is David Hossick, a prominent New York physician. And yet another eerie parallel with the Burr-Hamilton duel, Hossack also was the doctor who attended Alexander's death.
That's right. And so here, historically, Philip Hamilton is taken to the home of John and Angelica Church, and that's where the doctor meets them, and he's taking care of Philip while he's on what we know to be his deathbed. And it is a really sad scene historically.
So the doctor informs him that the bullet entered just above the hip and lodged into his right arm. And that's because Philip was standing sideways to minimize exposure in the duel. And so the bullet would hit him and go through his body, tearing through his abdomen and into his arm, lodging and staying there, basically wreaking havoc on his internal organs.
And that would explain why, as the doctor says in these lyrics, he's lost a lot of blood.
Right.
And Hamilton is still desperate to see his son. The doctor explains. He has very good bedside manner. He's very calm in the musical. The doctor is calmly trying to explain things. He doesn't get exasperated at the desperation that Hamilton is showing. He says, "You have to understand, I'm doing everything I can, but the wound was already infected when he arrived."
Right. And historically, that's probably not true. He died within 24 hours of being shot, and infection takes a little longer than that to happen. But it's a nice touch of the musical here. And here we get this really solemn moment where Alexander gets to talk to his dying son. And Philip says, "I did exactly as you said, Pa. I held my head up high." Hamilton replies, I know. Mirroring the heartbeat with his I knows. Kind of echoes a death scene from Rent, actually, where Mimi says, "I should tell you Benny wasn't any," and Roger says, "Shh, I know."
I know. Before he sings Your Eyes in Rent, that's a really heartbreaking moment.
"I should tell you why I left. It wasn't because I didn't," and Mimi says, I know.
Finally, they actually have their meaningful understanding of one another. After the whole musical of Rent they're just speaking past each other. They're not on the same page for a long time. Roger's run off, and now they're finally together. And I wish that Philip Hamilton would have that Mimi moment after the fact, and he will come back and have seen someone in the light, and the person in the light will tell him, "Turn around and listen to that boy's song, and you need to go back and come back." And I would have loved to see Philip Hamilton sit back up from his deathbed and live happily ever after.
Welcome back to Hamilton, the fan fiction podcast, where Philip just sits up and everything's fine.
Right. The end.
No, sadly not the end.
Shucks. I do like here that you have his father being a calming presence, that Philip is trying to, between gasps and between coughs, Philip is explaining what he did, and Alexander Hamilton is looking at him saying, "I know you did everything right. You did everything you were supposed to do. I'm proud of you. Just be quiet. Save your strength and stay alive."
Yeah. And Philip here says, "Even before we got to 10, I was aiming for the sky." Now, I know this is a stretch, but I like this almost double entendre idea of who he could have been. Even before the age of 10, even when he was a young child, he was aiming for the sky. He was shooting upward like his father, and he was destined for great things.
Yeah, we definitely would look back on Philip's life and say that all the things that had been poured into him, all the education, all of the promise that had been put into this kid, and the education he had up until the age of 10 and beyond, we would have thought that he was aiming for great things, that he would have risen up. He could also be aiming for the clouds in heaven and something. I mean, we can stretch those lyrics as far as we go, but the thing that I really draw out of this moment that's really sobering for me is I've been at the deathbed of family members. I've been at the deathbed of loved ones, and as heartbreaking as that is to be dealing with all of the emotions that go through that, all the questions of, is this the end? Is it not? Am I going to have more time? Am I not? Should I keep making plans or should I not? There's that uncertainty, but I know also that there's a big guilt that comes when you're sitting next to someone who's dying and you start thinking about all the things you should have done, all the things you should have done differently, all the things you wish you would have done that you didn't take the time to do. And here, Alexander is looking at his son, and he's having to face the guilt that he is the one who gave that advice to his son.
Right.
He is the one who is, in a large degree, to blame for the trajectory that set Philip towards this point of the deathbed. And so when Eliza walks in, and her first words when she storms in are, after she gets into what's going on, she says, is he breathing? Is he going to survive this? Who did this? Alexander, did you know? And so that guilt that he's already got to feel is absolutely piled on because of the first words Eliza actually directs to him in his presence, since the Reynolds pamphlet was published. I feel that guilt. I feel that shame and that embarrassment, and that is so hard.
Yeah. When the lyrics were Hamilton and Philip talking, the music has calmed down there. But as soon as Eliza enters, already in her grieving black dress, the music intensifies again as Hamilton says, "Save your strength and stay alive." And Eliza approaches, like you mentioned, Robbie. Is he breathing? Is he going to survive this? And the way she delivers that line with such pain, such anger.
Yeah.
You feel all the emotion in that performance. It's beautiful.
Beautiful and heartbreaking.
And she's completely ignoring Alexander's call to her, that Eliza there. She's concerned about her son. She's not even worried about, I'm not even going to look at you.
Yeah.
What has happened?
Yeah. She goes straight to her son. And the first time she does turn to Alexander is with fire.
Yeah.
Fiery passion in her eyes to say, "Alexander, did you know about this?" Through clenched teeth almost.
Yeah. And there is that connotation there that this is another thing added on. You allowed our son to go to a duel. After everything else you did this to me now. Which, let's get a little bit of hope here. Makes it so much more beautiful when the forgiveness comes later. Because it's one more thing for her to have against him.
That may be a little more hope, but it's still tearful hope because it's something that we cry at the pain, we cry at the loss. I also cry those tears of forgiveness, can you imagine? But here, it is incredible the stress that they're going through. Philip, in his conversation with his mother here, is devastating.
Right. "Mom, I'm sorry for forgetting what you taught me." And we could read into this a lot. I like to think that it's that idea that, hey, legacy doesn't matter. Stay alive. That was her message to Hamilton.
Yeah.
You can imagine that's what she would teach her children. Legacies don't matter. Stay alive. Let's be a family. Let's love. Let's live. But instead, he took his father's route.
Yeah, he was definitely following in his father's footprints and wasn't really tracking with the direction that his mother would have wanted his life to go. And she was definitely the one who had the reputation of being the strong, moral Christian woman. She was always religious, always at church, did not approve of some of those aggressive actions that were being taken. And we had seen her earlier in this act, in Act 2, teaching and bringing up Philip. Alexander Hamilton had not really been present in the teaching of his son, even though Philip wanted to idolize his father and eventually followed in his father's footprints. In the musical, Eliza was the one who was pouring into him, teaching him, playing piano with him, teaching French to him. Philip was taught by his mother, inspired by his father, and followed a route that took him to the same death as his father.
Yeah, and that's what they're going to discuss here is the piano scene. Eliza says, "My son." And the way she says it mirrors exactly the way Alexander said it in Dear Theodosia. It brings that right back around, these bookends on Philip's life, his parents' pride and love.
Yeah, but one scene has it so optimistic and hopeful, and the other scene has their hope dying.
Exactly. And Eliza brings up, "You change the melody every time."
Which is exactly what he did. Whenever she would go through and sing her arpeggios in French and her scales, she would end with "7, 8, 9," and Philip would say "7, 8, 9," with a little bit of a change to it. He would change the melody every time, and she would try to repeat, "This is how it's done." He would change it up a little, just got that little naughty Philip, just being a little bit of a troublemaker, just in a innocent way as a 9-year-old kid.
Yeah, and she says it here in this endearing way, like, "I love that you were an original, that you weren't willing to just follow all the rules perfectly." And he says, "I would always change the line," like his father changed the game.
Right. I like that is the happy moment they're trying to recapture. They're trying to transport themselves back to that happy memory.
And ironically, Philip does change the line when he says, "I would always change the line," where she said, "You changed the melody." Although it means the same thing, it is different.
It is slightly different. He's doing the same thing again.
She says, I know, mirroring that heartbeat, that same thing that Alexander said. And they go into their counting.
Yeah.
And as Eliza sings the word "set," Philip dies. The heartbeat stops in the music. And just like he always changed the line as a child, here he's changed it by not finishing it.
I don't know if I'm okay.
I don't know if I'm okay.
I don't. This is hard. This is the exact emotional reaction that we're supposed to have. I don't know if I'm able to communicate that emotion on a microphone because there aren't words to say what this feeling is. There aren't words to capture how much heartbreak there is. Whenever I feel that heartbreak, I can't put it into words. My sentences border on senseless. It's hard to actually talk about this because it is devastating.
Yeah, and having never lost children ourselves, we can't know what they're going through.
Yeah, I won't even pretend to imagine. I can put myself into as close a situation as I have personally felt, but even that's not the same as a child that is supposed to continue your legacy. And that's something that Hamilton has loved and valued for so long. And here you see that his legacy, at least in Philip, is not going to be continued.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, at the same time as Philip's duel at this moment, Eliza is historically pregnant with their next child. And when he is born, they name the child Philip. To remember their elder son and to say that their line of Philips will continue through this younger Philip. And so it's a little bit of a respectful homage and a respectful reference historically to that.
Yeah. Dying in the middle of a duet is actually a recurring theme in musicals. This also happens in Les Mis and in West Side Story. I thought that was interesting when I was researching this. I don't know a lot about musicals. You probably knew that, Robbie.
Mm-hmm. Well, I hadn't personally thought about those particular connections, but you're right. I know exactly the duets you're talking about. It's always a sad effect.
Yeah. And one of the things you might have missed out on if you've only heard the recording and not seen the show is that at the end of this, and it's so much more heartbreaking, Eliza lets out this scream, this wail of pain and sadness over losing a child. And you have to watch it there in the staging and sit with her for a moment as she screams in despair.
Heart-wrenching. It slays me when you see someone who has such posture, such poise, and such confidence, and such quiet bravery on the stage. In every single one of her scenes, Pippa is brave, and she is confident and strong and beautiful and lovely, and she loses it when she screams at the loss of her son. That is hard to hold it together while you're watching it.
Yeah. It's one of the things that Lin-Manuel decided to save for people who see the musical.
And since I struggle somewhat to articulate the emotion that is going on here, I'd like to just read a paragraph from Ron Chernow's biography about this, where he is talking about what is happening on Philip's deathbed and what has happened in this scene. And he references a couple different quotes from people that were there, friends and family that surrounded Philip. And this is what Ron Chernow says. Alexander and Eliza clung to their groaning son through a dreadful night. Henry Dawson recorded this wrenching tableau, saying, "On a bed without curtains lay poor Phil, pale and languid, his rolling, distorted eyeballs darting forth the flashes of delirium. On one side of him, on the same bed, lay his agonized father. On the other side, his distracted mother. Around him, numerous relatives and friends, weeping and fixed in sorrow." Those words, that's heartbreaking. Chernow goes on, after he ends the quote there, and he says, "After professing faith in Christ, Philip Hamilton died at 5 a.m, some 14 hours after receiving the mortal wound. He was buried on the rainy day with an enormous throng of mourners in attendance. As he approached the grave, the faltering Hamilton had to be propped up by friends. By all accounts, he behaved bravely in the face of calamity. Quote, his conduct was extraordinary during this trial, Angelica Church wrote. For a long time, Eliza was inconsolable. Despite the feared miscarriage, her 8th and final child was born at the Grange on June 2nd, 1802. Remember that this is the one she was pregnant with at the time of Philip's death. And they christened him Philip in memory of his deceased brother. Often, this one was called Little Phil. Philip Schuyler expressed the entire family's hopes when he wrote to Eliza saying, "May the loss of one be compensated by another Philip."
And interestingly enough, Eckerd is never prosecuted for Philip's death. And Hamilton writes angry articles in the New York Post and called for dueling to be outlawed, but nothing ever came of it.
Can you imagine history if Alexander Hamilton's calls for dueling to be outlawed officially and to be prosecuted and attacked? Can you imagine if those were actually addressed and if George Eckerd was prosecuted and if later on it was so dangerous legally for them to engage in dueling that maybe Vice President Burr wouldn't have challenged former Treasury Secretary Hamilton to a duel. How different would that be?
Yeah, things would have been vastly different. And on another small note, Eaker himself actually dies around 2 years later from consumption.
Yeah, I read about that. I don't know if consumption is the same thing as tuberculosis or what it is historically when they're looking back on that. I've seen a couple different sources that talked about the cause of his death. Apparently, George Eaker's brother or some relative actually said, no, it wasn't just the disease. It was because he ran into a burning building. George Eaker eventually became a volunteer firefighter, I think, and he was on the roof of a building and inhaled some bad fumes, and it was a cold day, and so he was very sick, had a lot of bad things happening health-wise, and that particular heroic act of trying to save someone's life in a burning building is what caused George Eaker's death. We don't know what it is. Obviously, his relative has a vested interest in his legacy being protected and him being remembered as a savior rather than as someone that we remember him from this musical as the person who was the antagonist to Philip, the person that attacked him and killed him. But it is interesting to me that he dies the same year that Alexander Hamilton will die, about 5 or 6 months earlier than Hamilton. So Alexander Hamilton did live long enough to see George Eaker's passing.
And you might remember from a previous episode how Angelica, the 17-year-old daughter, kind of lost it after this death. This is where her downward spiral starts.
That's right. So Philip's sister, Angelica, was super attached to her brother. They were joined to the hip for a long time. She's 17, he's 19. They were really close in age. They had a lot of the same interests. They loved each other so much. And to her dying day, she suffered a mental breakdown that she kept talking about her brother as if he was alive, kept talking about him as if he was still there. Looking into this historically, Alexander Hamilton would often write to people trying to take care of younger Angelica, named after her aunt, obviously, who was in a really tough situation. And even in Eliza's will, Eliza asked for all of her children to be kind, affectionate, and attentive to my said unfortunate daughter, Angelica. Because to their dying day, Angelica Jr., so to speak, the younger Angelica, was never okay after her brother Philip died.
Right.
To use Ron Chernow's words again, after Philip's death, Hamilton tumbled into a bottomless despair. Though he was no stranger to depression, he had never lapsed into the lethargy that usually accompanies it. He was absolutely inconsolable for quite a while. And there are a couple letters that we have that were written to the Hamilton family expressing their condolences, expressing their grief at the loss and how they wished them the best in the middle of their dark, dark time. In one of the letters that Alexander Hamilton writes in response to his friend Benjamin Rush, he talks about at the beginning of the letter how he felt the weight of the obligation that your family, Benjamin Rush, has taken care of us and has expressed some very good, kind things to us. I wanted to write to you earlier, but I had to wait for a moment of greater calm to express my sense of the kindness that you gave me because I wasn't okay for a long time. Couldn't actually write to you well for quite a while. And he says this in a paragraph: "My loss is indeed great. The highest as well as the eldest hope of my family has been taken from me. You estimated him rightly. He was truly a fine youth. But why should I repine? It was the will of heaven, and he is now out of the reach of the seductions and the calamities of the world, full of folly, full of vice, full of danger." He talks about how this world is terrible, and it's dark, and it's scary, and at least he finds comfort in the fact that his son is in a better place, has been transported beyond the darkness of this world to a place where he says that he has safely reached the haven of eternal repose and felicity. And he's talking about how he's comforted by his faith that his son is in a better place, but he's still grieving. He's still grieving the loss. It's not enough to say that I do believe that his life continues in the hereafter. What matters to me also is that I have lost him. So he does express that he has hope for a future with him, but he also expresses that he has grief that he has lost him now. And so I think that you see in Hamilton at this point in history the same thing that you see in every grieving person who has ever lost something, that they're longing for a way to express how to move on. They're waiting for that new normal to happen. They are waiting for how they can move past what things used to be and get to what things are going to be next. To get to that new normal is very hard and very complicated. And Hamilton here obviously has some complicated, rough things to work through. And we see that very well done in Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical here, and in his performance with Pippa, and the way that these two grieving parents are grieving over their son's body. I think that it is incredible that they don't have words to follow up this moment. After Eliza screams, they don't say anything for a while. Angelica comes on stage and is our narrator to take us into the next song, and that next song is the one that if you have had dry eyes up until now, you better grab the tissues.
Right. This emotion train is not over.
This is hard, Vinton.
Yeah, it really is.
When we started talking about doing a Hamilton podcast, it seemed really simple and fun because we were talking about the first act, and we were getting through all the first act episodes, and we were getting through some of the cabinet battles, had some fun times. Dang, these 3 episodes are hard. The last one, this one, and then the next one. My goodness, this is emotional.
Yeah.
I'm going to be ready to say, can we get back to politics, please?
Exactly. So that brings us to the end of our song, the end of our episode. Remember, all of our episodes are now on YouTube.
That's right.
Look up Graphomania on YouTube, and you should be able to find it from there. You can also look up Hamilton the Podcast, but we'll be a few down because there's a few videos that have a lot more views than we do.
Because we just started.
Exactly.
We just put them on YouTube.
But check that out, and please subscribe on there and give us a thumbs up.
Yeah, and go ahead and share those with your non-podcast listening friends, because a lot of people will not go into Pocket Cast or Stitcher or iTunes to find podcasts, but everybody goes to YouTube at some point.
Exactly.
And so I've already heard people that had not listened to our podcast yet who were on YouTube and got into it and have been able to share it with their family members and friends. It's been really exciting to branch out into new media like that. And it's the same episodes you've heard already if you're listening to our podcast and you've gotten up to here. But definitely share this with people. That would be a big help to us.
Definitely. And remember, you can always contact us. Contact@graphocast.com. Leave comments on our website, graphocast.com. Hit us up on Twitter @graphocast. Or personally, I'm @FleshEater.
And I'm @Alpha Knight.
And remember, we have a Patreon page. I'd like to quickly just say thank you to everyone who's been so supportive in their giving, so generous in supporting what we're doing here at Graphomania, and specifically with Hamilton the Podcast. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Check out patreon.com/graphocast if you would like to be a part of that and get some exclusives. Until next week, I'm Vinton Bayne.
And I'm Robbie Hurlocker.
Next episode, the moments that words don't reach. The suffering too terrible to name. It's going to get a little quiet uptown.
Vinton, do not quote those words yet. The suffering is too terrible to name. I can't handle it.
That's for next time, not for now.
Future Robbie and future Vinton will have to cry that one out.
Yep. Goodbye. Hi, Vinton Bayne here again for a real quick announcement. The Graphomania Podcast Network has a new podcast, Read Brave Comics, a comics podcast where your hosts, Corey Casto and I, will introduce you to a wide variety of segments about the world of comic books, some of which will include segments by me and Robbie from this very Hamilton podcast. Check it out now on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play, or at graphocast.com, graphocast.com. That's Read Brave Comics.